really shit.
I know it's gonna
Is there more than one? It's not in
No, yes, there's a lot of those.
thought that was
Just a small. There's been other ones sort of come and go years, but there's a small one at the port. So called fish. After okay. And
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so very much for joining us here tonight. We're incredibly excited because for the first time in a decade, we are welcoming Yann Martel back to Winnipeg in support of his brilliant new book, Son of Knopf. We'll get out of your way very soon so that we can begin the actual evening. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are, of course, here in Treaty 1 territory, and the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Niniwag, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. Son of Nobody has been incredibly well received by readers throughout the province and also by reviewers thus far. Kirkus Reviews called it a brilliant novel of ideas, a powerful meditation on life, death, and the vanity of human wishes, all illustrated by a poem that would do Homer proud. A stunningly imagined revisitation of an ancient past that is every bit as awful as the present. We're very grateful to Knopf Canada for publishing this book and for making this evening a reality, and of course to Ben Sigurdson of the Winnipeg Free Press for coming on board to stick handle this particular conversation. Following the conversation itself, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, so please do allow those to percolate over the course of the evening. When it comes time for questions, I'll approach you in a non-threatening manner with this microphone, just to ensure that everyone can hear your questions. And then at the end of the event, I'll be back to go over signing procedure. So please do stay tuned for that. The only thing I'll put in your head right now is that we'll ask you to remain in place for just a moment at the close of the event while we safely transport Yann to the signing table. But for now, I have the great pleasure of introducing both of tonight's participants. Your host, Ben Sigurdson, is the literary editor, drinks columnist, and a writer in the Arts and Life Department of the Winnipeg Free Press. In 2005, Ben graduated from the University of Manitoba with an MA in English. He has served as a juror for regional and national book prizes, including the 2022 Kobzar Book Award and the Manitoba Book Awards 2022 McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. He has 3 cats. Yann Martel is the author of Life of Pi, the global bestseller that won the 2002 Man Booker Prize and was adapted to the screen in the Oscar-winning film by Ang Lee. He is the author of 3 other novels, Self, Beatrice Virgil, and the High Mountains of Portugal, and a short story collection, The Facts Behind the Helsinki Roccamatios. He lives in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Please give him a very warm welcome.
Forgot to get them to take that out. Just so you know,
well, we have a cat and we love our cat. We had a dog and I realized I don't particularly like my dog. I'm not a dog person. And then my daughter said, can I get a cat for Christmas? And we unwillingly got one. This is totally unrelated to anything, by the way. My partner is allergic, so we found a hypoallergenic species. They can't be fully hypoallergenic. We got a species called Siberian. And we got it from my daughter, who within a week was not interested in her cat. So he was orphaned and he fell upon us, and we all, the rest of the family fell madly in love with our cat. We adore our cat. He's the most cuddled and held cat. So I'm totally fine with the cats.
Well, maybe we'll come back around to animals as they relate to, it's tangentially to Son of Nobody, which I adored and had a chance to read a couple times. We spoke last week for an interview in Free Press. And this time we figured, I've got a couple questions to sort of get us going, but I know a lot of you haven't heard much from Yann, and especially since he's not been here for the better part of a decade. So we'll get the ball rolling and then quickly turn it over to all of you, because I think we'd all rather hear from all of you than from me. But mainly we want to hear from you. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about how this book came to be? It's 10 years in the making, essentially.
Not really. In addition to my cat and my dog, and we also have a tortoise, if you're interested. We have a tortoise. We also got a tortoise recently, and I love my tortoise too. So everything but a dog. It didn't take quite 10 years. It's just that 10 years ago, my youngest child was newborn. So we have 10 years ago, I had a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a baby. So my partner and I were quite busy and blissfully busy. So no, it didn't take 10 years, but I'm a slow writer. Thanks to you and the success of Life of Pi, I don't have to produce quickly. I can produce slowly. So this book quite obviously came about because of the Iliad. I hadn't read it until a few years ago. I came to it quite late. I've grown up on the Greek myths, like a lot of us who like stories. They're amazing. They're incredibly entertaining and yet very insightful as to the human psyche, how we operate, how it feels to be human. You know, the obvious one of Sisyphus pushes up the boulder, it rolls down, he has to push it back up. That feeling of futility is one that we all at some point in our lives feel for, or Tantalus, where you're endlessly tempted by something. So the Greek myths spoke to me greatly, and I read wonderful retellings of them, but I never read the original material until just a few years ago. My partner, Alice, said, oh, I just read it. She'd been seeking, she's a more enterprising reader than me, actually. And she finally found a translation that she really liked, because she tried other translations. There's so many translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and some are frankly quite deadening. I suppose at university, when you are, I guess, harder working as a reader, you're willing to take them on. But as a reader who just wanted to hear what this was about, I would have given up. But she showed me a translation by an American poet named Stephen Mitchell. And that hit home because I'd already read a translation of Gilgamesh by him and his letters to Rilke, or the letters to Rilke. So I already was well disposed towards him. So I read this book and I thought it'd be venerable and boring. It's a strange work. It's not one you absorb in one go. It's not like a 19th century novel that's you just fall into. It is a rougher ride than that. But considering it's the West's first book, literally the first book that was ever written down in the West, it's an extraordinary book. So I read it in the Stephen Mitchell translation, and I read it and was surprisingly interested. And what happened is I started getting an artistic reaction, not just a reader's reaction, but an artistic one. I could do something with this. There are several elements about the Iliad, the Trojan War, that I think are still pertinent today. First of all, it was a siege. It was a war, lots of battles, and we like battles. We like violence for some reason as a species. We find the suffering, the bloody suffering of others, sometimes grandly entertaining. So it is like that. There's a lot of violence. But between that, it was a siege where there were no battles and they just waited. And the phenomenon of waiting is very much a modern phenomenon. You know, you hurry to the airport to then wait. You're waiting for a green light. You're waiting to see your doctor. You're waiting for a promotion. Waiting for Godot. Waiting is a very 20th century phenomenon. And while they were waiting, the Greeks also in the Iliad asked themselves a lot of very thoughtful questions. That's particular to the Greeks, I think. There's something inherently investigative about their approach to things. So while they're madly slashing at each other and killing each other, during pauses, they ask questions about basically the meaning of life. You know, Sarpedon and Glaucus at one had to think, why are we here? Where our soldiers venerate us, so we have to perform, we have to fight, because otherwise they wouldn't respect us and we wouldn't get all this food and this honor. They said, well, why don't we just go home? Why don't we have longer lives? I said, but then they'd be anonymous. Do you want a life of anonymity? Here we might live more shortly and briefer lives, but we will be known forever. So there's the kinds of questions that struck me as very modern. We work endlessly in our society, and we are always, aren't we driven by ambition? Like, I want to be the CEO, I want to be somewhere, I want to achieve. Well, ultimately, is it worth it? So there's a lot of questions that struck me. And so the result eventually was this, and this is a book that arose basically out of that single epic, Homer's Iliad. I did do research. Homer is a world unto himself, sort of like Shakespeare. You can really lose yourself in it. So I read the Stephen Mitchell translation several times, and then I referred to a number of other translations. In a funny way, the worse the translation, the more I thought it must be faithful to the Greek. So there's one by a man named Richmond Lattimore, which perhaps some of you who study classics somehow managed to read. I admire you for doing that, because I certainly couldn't. But I looked at it because I thought this must approach the original Greek more, which is not necessarily the case. It all comes down to the artistry of the translator. So I did that. I compared and contrasted various translations. And another thing that struck me is that in the Iliad, everyone who speaks, literally every single person who speaks is either a god or a goddess or some noble, either a king or a queen or a princess, except with one single exception. In book 2, there's a man named Thersites who's mocked by Homer as being the ugliest soldier in the Greek army. He speaks, and what does he do? He rails against Agamemnon, the supreme commander of the Greek forces, saying, why are we here? What do we have to gain? You maybe have immortality and all the gold and all the girls. We get nothing. So why should we do this? From the perspective of a modern reader, that makes complete sense. Why would these soldiers stay for 10 years with nothing to gain? And it's interesting, in the Iliad, Thersites is promptly beaten by Odysseus and mocked. And it makes no sense. Like, he's saying perfectly real thing. Why would the army back him up? But they don't. He's questioning the social order, in a sense like Achilles is, and so he's promptly beaten down. But to a modern reader, so that struck me too, this little man who speaks from the point of view of a commoner and is promptly beaten down, which is why in Son of Nobody is the nickname, the insulting nickname of the main character, so as in Medea. It came to me quite naturally that I would take the perspective of a commoner, like we all are today. We are all citizens, which is basically the atom of our society is the citizen, and that seemed to be the natural perspective to take.
And that perspective also comes through on the bottom half of the page. Now, if you have the book, you can see that the top of the page is the Soad, this epic poem, and the bottom consists of footnotes, and the footnotes are by essentially a parallel modern day, very small town scholar who goes to Harvard, Harlow Dunn, and not only he comes from that same perspective, but he also has conversations, like the two texts sort of have conversations with each other in and out. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, I wanted to tell, in a sense, two stories. The story of this alt Homerica, told from the point of view of a commoner, so Soas, hence the name of the epic, the Soad. But I also wanted to have a modern parallel. The point of looking at the past is, in some ways, you can do it just for entertainment, just to, Arthurian legends. There's nothing wrong with that. But I also wanted to nonetheless illuminate today. So I needed a parallel. And to me, very few of us have actually been in a war. So I wanted something that would speak to a modern reader. So the breakdown of a relationship is a kind of war. You see that in couples that fall apart. It does feel very warlike, the same kind of stuff. Physical, well, it could be physical violence, but I mean, the emotional bruising is the same. So in parallel with this epic of the Trojan War, there is also Harlow Dunn's story of his relationship falling apart. But I also wanted to, it came very early on to me that this would be a story in verse and footnotes. The verse are sort of more uniform. They tell the story of Soas when he arrives at Troy and various incidences until it comes to some sort of end. That was quite, it's quite linear, chronological, that you can follow quite easily. What I liked about the footnotes is several things about it. First of all, it allowed me to say a lot of different things in close contiguity. I mean, it's the nature of a footnote to be its own little thing. Footnotes 2 and 3 don't have to be at all about the same things, as they are referring to different lines in a text, so you can approach. So some of the footnotes are Iliadic. I don't presume that you've read the Iliad, so they give you a little bit of illumination as to what the Iliad is about. Then some are Soadic, so they're about the Soad, this other tale of the Trojan War. And then some, you're right, have to do with Harlow's own degrading life, this life that's falling apart. And so I like this idea of the reader, in a sense, having to weave it all together. And I like the interplay between the two. To me, it's kind of like a respectful dialogue. When the top of the page is speaking, the bottom is white, and then at the end of a fragment, at the bottom of it, you start having the footnotes. And so now the footnotes are speaking. So it's kind of a dialogue between the two, and you're sort of listening to it. And at the end, you have to weave it all together, what it might mean. So I like that kind of deconstructed text. And also, symbolically, it worked as a nice metaphor for me, because the verse refers to old things. It is said 3,000 years ago, and refers to, so that's kind of the past, and then we have the present. But the little footnote, which is sort of a minor character in literature, most novels don't have footnotes, and they're slightly unloved, but to me they're essential because they explain. So to me, one of the lines I like in my own book is, I say at one point, we're all footnotes to a greater story. we're all small parts of something much bigger. We may think we're not essential, but in fact, our collective stories, each of you little footnotes account, for example, for the life of Winnipeg. And each one of you is essential in making that and weaving that story. So I like this story that's told as much by the footnotes as by what's above. What's above is supported by the footnotes, just as our democracy is supported by each one of us as citizens.
Mhm. Absolutely, and that comes through, and the interplay is in the book is between the two halves of the pages is just fantastic, in my opinion. But you know, less people potentially feel a little bit nervous about getting into something that is visibly looking like a piece of the classics, right? Like it's not written in a way that is it's easy to get into. It's very approachable, and some of the language you use, you don't stick to the sort of classic meter and rhyme, but you know, and even some of the words that you and the phrases that you bring into the top part of in the Soad in the ancient Greek poem are sort of kind of humorously riff on modern language and idioms as well.
Right, I didn't want it to be hard to read. In a sense, the Iliad's not hard to read. After all, it was an oral poem. It was delivered by bards. And just as in theater, things will be repeated several times that you can get it, because after all, you only hear it once, you may miss it. So the Iliad was meant to be recited and was meant to be very understandable by audiences. So in fact, despite being this great classic, it's actually extraordinarily approachable. It's really not a very complicated thing. It starts, as the expression goes, in media res. It starts right away with this quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles over a priest who wants his captured daughter back. And initially Agamemnon refuses, and therefore the gods curse the Greeks and they start dying in their dozens and hundreds and thousands. And so eventually they realize that this is the mistake that they made. So this captive woman, Chryseis, has to be returned. Well, then Agamemnon, like stupid, angry man that he isn't dissatisfied. Well, someone's taken my slave girl that we captured. I want another one back. And so, well, we've already divided up because this is such a sexist piece of work. Women are like furniture here. Like, you've stolen my table. I want another table. Well, all the tables have been distributed already, so you can't have a table. Well, I want your table. So Agamemnon says, I will take your captive girl, Chryseis, from you, Achilles. And so Achilles is furious. So he turns his back on the Greek forces and refuses to fight, and hence the Greeks start losing. So it's all completely clear. And what's one thing that's amazing in the original, in the Iliad, is some of the scenes are like, there's one scene, for example, where Achilles, when he finally returns to combat, he slaughters so many Trojan soldiers near this river, the Scamander, that the Scamander River, the river god, gets angry at Achilles because he doesn't like having his river being red with blood. So he tries to drown Achilles. So you have a river pursuing a man across a plain. Can you imagine in a movie, this water running after a man to try to drown him? And Hera, because the gods always take sides, Hera sends Hephaestus, her son, to save Achilles, which he does by basically throwing flames at the river Scamander. So you have a blast of flames hitting the water god, who doesn't like water because the flame evaporates him. So that's what saves Achilles from drowning, because he can't swim, of course. So, and it's a marvelously cinematic scene. So it's an extraordinary work like that. So and I try I read it very carefully, and I just closed my eyes and started riffing on that. And as you said, it's in free verse, because I saw no point. The original is in the dactylic hexameter, which works really well in ancient Greek. It doesn't work in English. And classically, we use the iambic pentameter if we're 300 years old. So I didn't. So mine's in free verse, precisely to allow me a looser meter, which is a looser way of saying things, so that it would just be approachable and get a certain rhythm going. But I didn't want to shackle myself to a particular set meter.
And it has that visually, it has that sort of classical look, yet at the same time is so approachable. There was one passage or one little thing that Hades says to Soaz when it's not a spoiler. I mean, at one point Soaz visits Hades, and Hades is talking about this, how he's going around, lifting mountains and all this kind of stuff and running back and forth. And Soaz asks, what is the purpose of these great exertions? And Hades replies, it gives my immortality a nice buff. So that's sort of every once in a while, there's something like that, just thrown in.
Yeah, it's claimed to be a translation, so he would
Yes.
translate whatever it was the term, like a buff.
And whatever
You
that
know,
was.
3,000 years from
Exactly.
ancient Greek.
Exactly. No, that's fantastic. But I mean, the Iliad has survived the ravages of time, thousands of years. I know it's the first text, the first Western text, so it is in its very nature important, but it could have just as easily landed in a museum or like been sort of cut off from the world rather than sort of translated and reproduced and continuously looked at, despite the dwindling classics departments out there, which is a topic for another time. But what is it about the story that continues to capture the imagination, you think?
Well, what struck me was the deep note of despair. Considering it is the Greeks' first book, you'd think they'd try to burnish their reputation. Present themselves first with this awesome thing called a book, and then this is the first book for a while, the only book, and then the second one was the Odyssey, another book by us Greeks, and you'd think they'd try to burnish the reputation. But in fact, the picture it paints of life at that time is utterly despairing. Life is brief, violent, always bedeviled by poverty, and indeed, after this mythical war, because there's no historical proof of the Trojan War. There was a city called Troy, 9 layers of it. There is wisps of evidence of tension between the Trojans and the Hittites, the empire to the east, and the Proto-Greeks, the Mycenaeans to the west across the Aegean Ocean. But there's no concrete proof of a war at all. And yet after whatever happened, and something obviously did happen because the bards started singing, shortly afterwards, Mycenaean civilization's totality actually did collapse. Life was that fragile. This is just one thing. This is the Bronze Age, one step ahead of the Stone Age. This is at a time when life was very, very difficult. At that time, Mycenaean culture was based on what was called the palace culture. So where the kings lived, Greece, what is now Greece, was divided into 20 or so squabbling kingdoms. The entire economy was based on the king's palace, where things would be manufactured, food stuff would be brought in and then redistributed. So it was sort of a very rudimentary economic system that collapsed in its entirety after whatever happened in the Mycenaean, in Troy. And as I said, the portrait you have of life is utterly despairing. Your life is short, it's brutal, and there is no redemption. Their view of the afterlife afterwards was nothing great. At the best, if you're at the apex of that society, you might end up in the Elysian Fields, which is sort of the top floor of the hotel in the underworld. And it was no great shakes. Ulysses in the Odyssey visits the underworld, and it's this very gray place where they move around like shadows, and all they want is to return to life. They ask, am I still talked about? Yeah, they're miserable there, and that's the best place. If you're in Tartarus, the lower floors of the hotel, it's even worse. So, and that's as good as it gets. So at most, if you're lucky, you might be remembered. That's as much as you'd get. And so I was struck also that deep note of despair that basically was saying life is barely worth living. And what a thing to say in your very first presentation. And so what struck me then is here we have something that happened, some unknown thing. It was finally written down in 700 BC. Incessantly talked about. The Greek language was tattooed all over it with Homer. It was the longest bestseller. Everyone else sold far less than him. Everyone knew Homer. It was cited endlessly until finally, there's another story that happened, and I mentioned this too. That's one sort of strand in the book too. I was interested in this other mythical story, and I'll explain what I mean by mythical, set in Palestine, this other story of Jesus of Nazareth, which has many of the similar features, also expressed in the same language. The oldest Christian texts are Paul's letter. They were written in Greek. Paul of Tarsus was a Greek-speaking Jew. And then the oldest, the foundational documents that account for Jesus are the Gospels, of course, and they were also written in Greek. So, and here you have the same sort of despair in life. Life was not much better, especially for Jews at that time. And yet the emotional note that story strikes is the polar opposite of what you get in the Iliad. So in the Iliad, it's the first word of the Iliad famously is wrath, menim, which means wrath, rage, anger. It's the very first word, which is the polar opposite. And I say this regardless of what you think of Jesus, by the way. Everyone would agree that the Gospels, the key emotion that is discussed is that of love. Not only God's love towards us, but also Jesus incessantly talks about love. So it's the polar opposite, and that struck me. These two mythical texts for which there's no historical proof. So as I said, the Iliad, the Trojan War, there's no historical facts. And the same thing that's interesting about Jesus, there's precious few historical facts. Just as no one denies that Troy existed, there are these dumpy little remains in Western Anatolia, south of Istanbul, south of Çanakkale, down in West. There's no one in any good faith will deny that someone called Jesus existed. But it's extraordinary how he does not live in history the way, let's say, Napoleon lives in history. There's 100 million facts you could find about Napoleon Bonaparte, all witnessed by other people. Whereas Jesus, we don't know when he was born. He wasn't born December 25th. That was decided 350 years later. And that's because the Romans thought it was the winter equinox. In fact, it was 4 days earlier. But they said, what better day to have a god be born? But when the days start getting longer, when more sunshine comes to us, what a perfect symbolic day for the birth of a god, but that he brings extra sunshine to us every day. He brings more light to our lives. So perfect symbolic thing, he'll be born that day. It's not historically attested to anyway. There is no birth certificate for Jesus. And the same thing with his death. That's even more, shows you how facts are not important in this story, in that we all know that he died on Easter, but Easter's a day, it's not a date. And what figure in history has his or her date of death vary year by year? Most of us, when they die, that's when you die, and it never changes. And there's nothing known about most of Jesus's life, except for, when he was born, these highly symbolic tales. A tale when he was forgotten in Jerusalem when he was 12, and then his ministry the last 3 years of his life. The rest of that is complete absence. And what we do know is highly polished parables and metaphors, and none of these taken directly from someone who met Jesus. That's extraordinary for someone who so changed history, how he's absent from history. No one who ever met Jesus, and that's what's surprising. This is a very highly literate time, Jerusalem in the year zero. A lot of people knew how to write. No one who met him ever wrote anything that has survived. Even though the Jews were literate and the Romans were literate, the earliest non-biblical reference is a historian named Josephus in 92 or 94, who accounts for this troublemaker named Jesus. He has no evidence, he just accounts for these rumors. As I said, nothing was written by someone who actually encountered Jesus. Some of the sources, Q, for example, seem to be from people who met him. Well, why didn't they write anything down? They all survived through these oral tales, much like the Odyssey and the Iliad survived for 300 years. For Jesus, it was quicker, it was like 30 years. But none of them, Paul didn't meet Jesus, nor did the evangelists. So anyway, all this to say there's precious few facts, but there's story. And that's one of the things that interested me in writing this book, is the same thing with Troy. Very few facts, but massive stories. And that's an inverse pyramid. If you think of it, there are some figures in history for whom we know 100 million facts. But do we ever discuss them? No. For some reason, they don't necessarily live in our imagination just because there's lots of facts. So I just arbitrarily use Napoleon Bonaparte. But you can think of most figures in history. There's so much of history. How much of it actually speaks to us? How much of it changes our lives? Of course, it does change our lives. It does. But do we storytell about it? Do we live with it? Does it actually change as a guide our individual lives? I've noticed that sometimes the fewer the facts, the more we can do something with our imaginations. And these two examples are Troy and Jesus. And what's important about those is they happen to be the foundational stories of the West. The Greeks were formed by Homer, and you can see Greek philosophy coming out of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Greek philosophy basically is the origins of half of who we are as Westerners. That thinking, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all that is the beginning of Western consciousness. And the other half are the Gospels. It doesn't matter what you care about, Jesus or Christianity, but that's the other foundational stories. How extraordinary. These two stories that are foundational to who we are, and they're pure fictions in the grand sense of the things. You can't access their truth through facts. How extraordinary. And that's why I think we have such a contradicting nature as Westerners, because we have one that's all axed on wrath and one on love. So the whole novel backtracks from a line towards the end where I say, I just know the last bit, but I might as well, right towards the end. And so the conclusion, no, not there. And so the conclusion, life is a walk, and while our bodies are solid, Our joints are strong and our vision is clear, yet we walk on feet of dreams. We walk on feet of dreams. So my feeling is that the West walks on these two grand feet of dreams of Troy, Jesus, wrath, love. And that's not just our civilization. I think each of us as individuals in the same way. We have our rationality, we have our education, but ultimately we walk on feet of dreams. We walk on things that can't be factually accounted for. And that's the way we want it, because then you can play with it a lot more. And indeed, people play a lot more with Troy and with Jesus than they would with historical figures. Remember that movie Troy with Brad Pitt? I remember watching that. Not a great movie, but still talks about Troy. But I remember being stunned at one moment when Agamemnon gets killed at Troy. Now, that's not what happened. He gets killed at home by his wife. He gets assassinated when he gets home. He doesn't get killed at Troy. That's not what happened. Then I realized, wait a second, that's silly. It's not what happened because nothing happened. We don't know. It's a fiction, so you can play with it. So the movie makers clearly wanted to make an emotional point, express our collective anger at Agamemnon for being such a stupid male. And so let's have him killed right now in the movie. And it doesn't matter what the other myths said. It's all myth anyway, so let's play with the myth. You can do that with myth. You can't do that with historical figures. You can't have, JFK not be assassinated and win a second term and be a great president for 2 full terms. Because everyone would say, well, no, he was killed in 63. What are you doing here? We don't allow ourselves to play with historical figures the way we do with mythical figures. And that's not necessarily at a loss, sometimes quite the contrary. How's that, Francie? Whatever question you had.
Well, you'll have to come back after the Christopher Nolan adaptation of The Odyssey comes out and let us know what you think.
I'm very curious to see that. He's a very able film director.
Yes. Well, perhaps we should get John to come back with his feat of dreams and mosey around through the crowd and see if anyone has any questions for Yann about anything. Nothing off top. Well, I mean, preferably probably about your boats.
My cats too, if you want.
My first question is, did Achilles meet Jesus?
Did Achilles? Oh, that would be an interesting one.
Meet Jesus?
Jesus, yeah, that would be interesting. He certainly was more
elaborated so
yeah.
much about him, about Jesus.
Yeah. Well, he does relent at the end of the Iliad and return the body of Hector, whom he killed, to his father, which does display that kind of loving kindness that we associate with Jesus.
But the real question is about names. And I start with your name, because in the second piece in the Free Press you wrote, it is said that you are of Spanish heritage, that your ethnicity. And I saw your name, Yann Martel, and I thought in the first piece you had written, I thought you must be Mennonite. And then I thought,
of course, I'm going to say I'm Mennonite. I'm in Winnipeg. Yes, I'm Mennonite.
no, I know that there are lots of Mennonites, yeah. But Martel, you say Martel or Martel?
Yeah, no, I'm not Mennonite. And I was born in Spain, but of Canadian parents. My father was studying in Spain, but they're from Quebec. And my first name, Yann, is from Brittany in Western France. It's the Breton variation of Ian, Juan, John. It's just that very, and Martel is French. I mean, originally French from France, but it's Quebecois. In fact, French is my mother tongue. Great question. How many pieces did you write about when you started the Free Press?
Just one. Just one. That I can remember.
I was one. First of all, hi, Daria. I'm a friend of.
Oh, Daria. Hello, Daria.
From Dallas. Say hi.
Yes.
I was wondering your writing process and whether you wrote the poem in its entirety or if you did a poem footnote or, yeah, I'm just curious about how you constructed it.
I did them in tandem. I'd write a fragment, then footnotes, and I wrote too many fragments, so eventually I got rid of some fragments, and then I had these little family orphans that I had to place, fragments that footnotes that I somehow took place. So, but I wrote them, I said, because it's a parallel line, they, in a sense, events speak to each other. There's a process of revelation in the footnotes. As I said early on, I talked about the Iliad for readers who haven't read it, and then there's certain things about the Soad to sort of illuminate it, and then there's a process of revelation for Harlow's life. So I wrote them, in a sense, like these 2 feet. One, sometimes I worked on a fragment, and then once I finished a fragment, I do its collection of footnotes. That was my process.
Hi, Anne. I was just wondering, have you seen your story adaptations on stage? Have you seen Life of Pi, for instance, on stage? And what do you think about the interpretation of your book live on stage with actors and puppetry?
Yeah, I saw that one several times because it started in Northern England in Bradford, and then I saw it in London, and I saw it in Boston, then I saw it in New York, then I saw it in Toronto. So I saw it many times. I liked it enough. I mean, the puppetry is quite wonderful. I liked it more than the movie. The movie was visually quite impressive, but I didn't think it captured the story much. If you hadn't read the book, it struck me the movie was more of an anecdote of, overcoming suffering and all that. There wasn't a proper accounting of the two stories. The second story, which is key in the book, it's a competition between two stories based on the same set of facts. In the movie, it's just accounted for verbally by Pi in his hospital bed. It's not quite given the weight it is given in the book, where you have both stories. And sure, one is shorter, but it's also told closer to the end. So it's more recent in your memory, which gives it more weight. And it confirms the kind of cynical beliefs we have about ourselves. So it struck me as the same weight as the first one. So there was a nice balance. Whereas in the movie, I didn't think it did. The movie lingered too much on things that were visually impressive, but not particularly relevant. It's a pity because I do love cinema and I like the risks that artists take, but curiously, Ang Lee, who's a wonderful film director, I loved Brokeback Mountain and The Ice Storm. He's a wonderful director, but those were always written by a man named James Schamus. In this case, he took what I thought was a weaker screenwriter, and bizarrely, you think I wouldn't complain about this, but he was too faithful to the book. Surprisingly, not much actually happens in Life of Pi. People don't quite realize that, but yes, you have a dramatic setting of a lifeboat in the Pacific, and you have a boy and a tiger. So that's a startling setup, but in fact, nothing happens. It's a bourgeois drama of two people stuck in a small apartment. They don't get along, but they just pass the time. They eat, they watch the weather, look at the weather out the window. Nothing happens, and it kind of works in the book. But it didn't necessarily, for me, work in the movie. They spent too much time in the Pacific. I'd suggested start in Mexico with the interrogation. Forget the two Japanese. We're not going to understand their accent. It doesn't matter they're Japanese. Have one be American and the other be a junior Mexican officer so they can speak really bad Spanish, which would be comic. And then you can have subtitles in English so that I wouldn't understand what you're saying, so they can speak in front of them but not be understood by him, which is what happens in part 3 of the book. And then have flashbacks, not too many, in India and in the Pacific. But so have the dialogue being the framework of the story, not the linear story in the Pacific, because I thought the movie kind of floundered once he was in the Pacific. So anyway, I was said it. I wasn't crazy about the movie, but the stage play was closer to the meaning of the book. And I did love puppetry. Puppetry was wonderful. Not only the tiger, we had 3 puppeteers doing the tiger, but all the various animals were beautifully done. And the music was lovely, and the wash of the special effects. Theaters, unfortunately, sometimes these big productions, they're trying to approximate cinema with amazing visual effects. And the screenplay was, the script was still a little bit weak in terms of slightly artificially trying to increase drama when the integrities come and see Pi in the hospital. But that's the nature of drama, right? You have a dialogue that goes up in tension, then down, up, down. So it's a surprisingly hard story to adapt. A graphic novel's coming out by a very, very able graphic novelist. So I'm looking forward to that. So listen, I did enjoy the play. I loved how the effects were right in front of your eyes. They weren't generated by a computer. They were physically being done in front of you. And so it asked you to believe. And because you're asked to involve yourself, I think people reacted very positively to the play. In a sense, more than the movie, which I think people maybe admired but didn't particularly like. I didn't warm up to it. He did win an Oscar for Best Director, but it didn't win for Best Movie. And I thought that was sort of fair. He worked extraordinarily hard on it, but I don't think it was as moving a movie as he hoped maybe it would be.
Are you involved in any way with the graphic novel? It just is done.
No, it's
entirely-
still being developed. He's done by someone in England. He said he's going to consult me, but I met him. In fact, I was just a couple of weeks ago. I was in Oxford, and we met up. But he's no, he hasn't. But he's been very careful. So I was consulted more on the script for the play.
Okay.
The adapter, Lolita Chakrabarty. We had many discussions and all that.
John, oh, there he is, hiding amongst the people. Looking around, looking for hands for anyone who's, oh, I see a couple up here, there's a couple back there as well. Get you all the way back up.
Hi, I'm a literary teacher or literature teacher, so thank you very much. And thank you for the new book. I'm very inspired to see how this plays with students. Not to send you right back to work, but your writing thus far has been very grounded in cultural tradition or history or trying to be very present. I wonder if you've ever looked into speculative works or if you could extend your great character work into something that you predict might be a fiction. Is that something that's ever crossed your mind? Or do you prefer the style of connecting to the past and tradition?
I'd say this one is the only one that really reaches into the far past. I mean, Life of Pi is sort of contemporary. So was Self, my first novel. Beatrice Virgil was about the Holocaust, or more importantly, its representations. You know what? I have no particular pattern. I'll tell you my next book. I'll tell you my next book because the more I talk about it, the more my publishers have to publish it.
He told me I had to ask about
Yeah,
it.
yeah. And he didn't yet, so I'll just do it. So I had, when I was working on Son of Nobody, at one point I had 6 weeks when my Canadian editor was going to read it. And I happened to be in Mexico on a fellowship, and my family was with me for the first week, and then they returned home. So I had a week alone, time on my own, with nothing to do. And for the first time, I thought about my mother in a different way. My mother has Alzheimer's. She's 85 and she has Alzheimer's. She's had that for a number of years. So it's, I thought about her a lot in sort of practical terms as a loving son of how I could take care of her. She was in a care home just outside of Saskatoon. But I thought of my mother differently in sort of an artistic terms. How could I react as a writer, as an artist to who she has become, this ghost of herself? And I've never done this before because I'm a very slow, methodical writer. I wrote an entire novel in 6 weeks. And it's a novel that's in 52 chapters, same number of cards in a deck of cards, same number of weeks in a year. So in the sense a year is a symbol of life. Life is kind of like a game, randomly given to you. And it's going to have to be published in a box because the 52 chapters are not bound. You can read them in any order. Except for the first one, the first booklet, I call them, will have the copyright pages because publishers like having their copyright pages first. So, and then otherwise you can shuffle the chapters and read them in any order. So I break with suspense, I break with chronology. You become like a little god. You know the result. There's something about Alzheimer's here, but I metaphorically play with this idea of losing chronology. And as you're reading a work about the loss of memory, I will test your memory because first of all, every single chapter is a single sentence with one exception. One chapter is not, but every other one is somewhere 16 pages long. It's one single sentence. I break it up to paragraphs, so it's not solid paragraphs. That's annoying. It's a single sentence with a lot of deviations, and sometimes a subordinate clause will not immediately follow what it's referring to. So as you're reading, your memory is tested, and there's several cross references. So, for example, at one point I discuss a classic French short story called La Chèvre de Monsieur Séguin, Mr. Séguin's Goat, which is a classic French short story by a man right from the 19th century named Alphonse Daudet. In one booklet, I translated into English, and in 2 other booklets, I discussed that short story. One to do with its punctuation, and then there's another reference. And depending how you read the book, how you happen to come upon this reference to La Chèvre de Monsieur Séguin, you will read it completely differently. And the same thing I discussed at one point, a short story by Kafka called Josephine and the Mouse People. And so there's incessant cross-references. At one point I talk about Yitzhak Shamir, who, if you remember, was a former prime minister of Israel. Not at all for political reasons. The only reason I mentioned Yitzhak Shamir is when I was growing up. Just as when I grew up, I'm 62, so I grew up in 63. When the AIDS crisis hit, the first celebrity to have it was Rock Hudson, if you remember the actor. He was sort of the poster child, in a terrible way, of AIDS. This was not just obscure people in the margins, even famous. So Rock Hudson was the sort of person who made AIDS famous because he himself was famous. Yitzhak Shamir, for me, was that for Alzheimer's. He's the first well-known person who I read about as having Alzheimer's. He was the first person, because all these tragedies usually kept secret, and then someone has to be revealed that they have Alzheimer's. So there's references and cross-references to Yitzhak Shamir. So incessantly I weave together these cross-references, but the whole book is in any order you want it to be. So you don't you get these references in different order. So I play on this. So I wrote it extraordinarily quickly, just following. Every day in Mexico, I started writing, and I spent the whole day writing. And as I said, it's in 52 chapters. Some as short as, one face of a page, some two, and then it goes 4, 8, 16. Exactly how pages would do if you do little booklets. And each is in a single sentence, as I said. So I wrote it in a completely breathless way, and I was extraordinarily excited about it. So I'll get back to that once I finish promoting this. And it's called The Forgiven and the Forgotten. Ask your booksellers about it.
Ask the publisher about it.
Yes.
I'm sure the publisher is probably shaking right now. Readers are shaking in anticipation. I'm sure booksellers who have to stock shelves are just scratching their head going, how are we gonna
Well, it's been done, and since I'm in Manitoba, Friesens of Altona, I had Friesens make a clamshell. And I was careful, I said, it's gotta be cheap. I said, okay, it has to be a single pass. So in other words, the cardboard goes through the machine only once. And in one go, it makes a clamshell, a book that opens like a clamshell, because you want it to be in a box so you can open it. And the chapters that you've read, you put on the left and the others stay in the box. So it's a single pass clamshell, which will make it cheaper. And you save on the glue. You don't have to have glue to bind the chapters. So I'm trying to make it, and because my publisher, I'm sure will say, it looks like a gimmick that's going to be in the joke section. I said, no, it's really not a joke. It's not a gimmick. There's a reason for this and it works. So anyway, that's the next one.
Well, when you go on a book tour for that one, I'll make myself available for it because I look forward to reading it. So, John, how's things looking out there?
Thanks for all of your work and your presentations today. I'm curious, you mentioned that you're Francophone, and I'm curious why you write in English.
Haphazard reasons. My parents are from Quebec. I speak French with them. I spent 10 years in France. My parents worked with the Foreign Service, so they were posted in Paris. But before that, as I said, I was born in Spain. Then they were studying. But then when they joined the Foreign Service, we initially lived in countries where there are no French schools. So I started school, in fact, in Victoria, preschool. And then we moved to Ottawa. And where we happened to be in Ottawa, Manor Park, there was no French school nearby. So there I went to school in English. And then we moved to Costa Rica. And at that time, there were no French schools. And then we moved to France, and definitely French schools there. But the local French school, the French educational system is pretty forbidding. And they weren't particularly sympathetic because we arrived mid-year. So my parents said, oh, there's a good British school. We'll send you there. So even in France, I went to school in English. So despite speaking French with my parents and living in France for 10 years and all, I did my entire schooling in English, and it just came naturally to write in English. And I like that. It's interesting. It's not necessary to speak more than one language. I think we over-valorize that in the sense that if you're stupid in one language and you learn another, it doesn't necessarily make you wiser. Look at the Europeans. They're often multilingual and they all hate each other. It took centuries for them to get along a bit better, and still now they're so you want to know one language deeply. You want one language where you can plumb the depths of your being, and every little thing that stirs in you can have a word attached to it. And for me, that's English. But I regularly, it's funny, sometimes there's certain words that I can never remember in English. So one of them, for example, is le mépris. And what does le mépris mean in English? I've just forgotten. Disdainful. When you're being very disdainful, what is that? You are expressing scorn. In English, it's scorn. I always forget the word scorn for some reason, but I never forget it in French, in part because there's a movie by Jean-Luc Godard called Le Mépris. So I remember scorn in French, but not in English. So occasionally I'll dip into French for a turn of phrase, perhaps. Very occasionally I'll commit Gallicism. So I used to say, when you're cleaning your house, I'll pass the vacuum cleaner. Because in French, it's passer l'aspirateur. Passer l'aspirateur. But you don't say pass the vacuum cleaner. You could, if I give you my vacuum cleaner, I'm passing you the vacuum cleaner. But what it means, you go straight to the word, you vacuum. That's what you do in English, you just vacuum. So occasionally, and it always humiliates me when my partner will point out, that's not English, dear. Okay, right. But I also speak Spanish quite well too, and more rarely I won't dip into Spanish, but because of where we used to live, I also picked up Spanish along the way. But I'm quite content writing in English. I don't like the spelling, it makes no sense. What I love about English is unbelievably flexible language. In French, if you make a mistake, they won't necessarily correct you publicly, but they will note, oh, he's made a mistake. He got some sort of a chord wrong. It just rankles the language. A little quill of a porcupine goes up every time you make a mistake in French. Whereas in English, we're not normally that persnickety. I mean, I always tell my children it's anyway, it's not anyways. I correct them about who and whom, me and I. You know, I'll correct those 3 rules of grammar. That's basically the essential foundation of English grammar, is those 3 little mistakes, and that's it. Otherwise, it's such a loosey-goosey language, which I love, which is why it's spoken around the world. There's Englishes, not just one, because so many people speak it, and they've really stretched it. So I love that really elasticity, the elasticity that English has, which French does not. French is just a more ill-tempered animal that growls more. It's a beautiful animal. I just finished a book because I was at the Salon du Livre de Quebec. I was in Quebec for a French, and I was with this French, Franco-Belgian writer. So I read this big fat book, and I just noticed that it's a slightly more cumbersome language. It does not want to make concessions. English wonderfully makes concessions incessantly.
One thing about language, and so nobody, sorry, I'll do one quick thing for you, and for you as well, I guess. In Harlow's introduction, talking about Greek and the way it was written was so fascinating to me, because we look at a book, we start at the top left, we go like this, line after line after line, whereas Harlow is talking about how in Greek, it's sort of a more natural feel. Can you talk just for it?
Yeah, that's something I love.
You can see
The language, Greeks invented twice language. Once was a thing called Linear B, which is an adaptation of a Cretan language, which was very, very cumbersome. It was only used for accounting of things that were in storeroom contracts. It was very rudimentary. Nothing of any poetic nature was ever found. Then they dropped it when the Mycenaean civilization collapsed in the Great Dark Ages. And around the 7th century, they reinvented writing when they borrowed this alphabet with no vowels from the Phoenicians, and they arbitrarily chose some as consonants. They discovered the alphabet, the alpha beta, and suddenly literacy exploded. And because they just discovered writing, nothing was set. So one of my favorite words in the English language is boustrophodon. Boustrophodon was a way of writing where you write from left to right. And then boustrophodon in Greek means as the ox plows. Ox that's plowing gets the end of a furrow, well, it just turns and goes this way. So boustrophodon was a way of writing and reading where you go from left to right, and then you just continue this way and spell backwards. So if you have box here, this way it would be B-O-X going right to left. So you just go down the page like this. When you're reading boustrophodon, you necessarily should shake your head and sway your head. It's a lovely way it snakes down the page like this. It's unbelievably beautiful. That was one way, but it was insane. They sometimes wrote in spirals or going inside or outside. They would sometimes write up and down, sometimes in boustrophodon up and down. It was completely insane. It took them centuries to agree on how to write. And sadly, we still follow their precept that you go from left to right, and then you chop the sentence. You get a cleaver and you chop your sentence, and you carry the remains to the left, and you go like this. So it's a completely cut up way, which to us seems natural, but it isn't at all. You have to sort of get to the end and reach over and land your eyes on the right word to continue. Now we do it automatically, but it's sort of a wasted millisecond. And also, why not just zigzag down the page? So that was called boustrophodon. So it was one of the charms. I wish we'd kept that in English, and everyone else can write, left to right, like Martinet.
I love that. John, sorry, I saw you passing the microphone over there.
Yeah, Mennonites. You met up with them in Saskatoon. And my question is, do you still use your first home as a launching pad for refugees?
Oh. Yeah, my house, my first house, I gave use to refugees in a program administered by the Mennonite Central Committee. Wonderful people who, just in the house, they had arranged these immigrant groups they didn't judge at all. That's what I loved about it. Well, I was so thankful for getting the Mennonites involved. We'd be Muslims, didn't matter who they were refugees, and these Mennonites would take care of them, and they'd use my house for a year. Refugees are allowed 1 year, so they'd have this house for free. Now it's no longer that because the refugees kind of dried up. This was when the Syrians were all coming and all that. Now instead it's being used by the Raimi Modern Art Gallery as a house where visiting artists come and stay. It's much cheaper for hotels, and I just add to the feng shui, to the karma of this house. Now it used to be refugees, now it's artists, refugees of a different kind.
We do have time for one more question before we go to closing comments. Yes.
Given the study you have done in your life about humankind, what's your reference about what's happening today worldwide?
Last question. Yeah. Well, I would say, we've been there before. We've been there before, and in fact, it's been worse. I mean, obviously, no one likes Donald Trump. He's borderline insane now. But he's not as insane as Adolf Hitler. Imagine if we were living in 1942 or 1916 in Europe, when literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people were being killed and cities were being entirely destroyed. There's a wonderful book by W.G. Sebald about the level of devastation that was wrought upon Germany, which of course would elicit no sympathy in us, because after all, they committed the Holocaust and they provoked this war that devastated the rest of Europe. But it was not that big a country. It was bombed to pieces by the Allies. In a sense, rightly so, but you're killing a child and a woman who's not a combatant. Doesn't matter where they're from, they're innocents. So the level of devastation was unreal, and the collapse of social order. So we've been there before, and it's been worse. And in some ways, you'll find this weird to say this, but I'm grateful for Donald Trump because he is shaking the cage. The worst thing for democracy is not excess, it's complacency. And it's a pity that Trump was against Hillary Clinton. I was very happy that a woman might become president, but Hillary Clinton is so establishment. She would not question things at all. Whereas if it had been Bernie Sanders, he would have rattled the cage. So it's a pity it wasn't Trump, Bernie Sanders, two radically different visions, one rooted in a reality and a genuine compassion, one fueled by narcissism. But nonetheless, he's pushed so many boundaries that I think it's a good thing for testing democracy. I think once we're through him, because none of them he has charisma. That's the problem with Donald Trump. He's not an intelligent man. He's profoundly ill-educated, can't even write proper English. He's the US president, but he has a vision. In fact, when I was talking about how no facts, lots of stories, Donald Trump's like that. He doesn't care about facts, which is why whenever you read a speech in the New York Times points out the 52 lies he's pronounced, in a sense, they're missing the point. Because it's not about facts, it's about a vision. It's about a sense, a story of grievance and resentment that dozens of millions can share, because in fact, the system has left them behind. Working class America has been left behind. The elites on the coast, they're fine. The Silicon Valley people, they're fine. But middle America is being squeezed. They worked so hard. I was in the US touring, and I was actually surprised at how expensive food was there. And thanks to you and your readers of Life of Pi, I don't care about the price of food, but I was shocked at how expensive it was. People who don't have much money, they're having difficulty feeding themselves. And the establishment was doing nothing for them. So Donald Trump, in a completely benighted way, is still pointing at a problem, saying America's not there for you. And that's true, but he has all the wrong solutions. He's beholden to these billionaires. He's in love with them. He has no solutions, but he has a story. And that's the problem with the Democrats, is they have to come up with a counter story. They have to come up with a vision which will uplift America and will probably tax billionaires and stuff like that. No society should have billionaires. There's just no reason why we should have such creations of wealth. So my view is that we've been there before. We have to do our work as citizens, free press, intelligent citizenry, you do have to vote. All that work that we Canadians do very well, we are remarkably resisting the siren call of Donald Trump. Well, yeah, it was a little bit of Trump light, but he's not doing very well, is he? You got Daniel Smith in Alberta and their Alberta separatism nonsense. But whatever, we have to, that's the other thing too with Trump, he's ugly. But at one point, it's like anger. You got to go through your anger. You can't repress anger. If someone's angry, they got to express their anger, and then they're going to calm down. So the same thing with America. They got to express their anger. They got to digest that ugliness, get it out of their system. Now, in the meantime, it's a pity. Trans people are suffering, gay people are suffering, women are being sort of put back in their place, they're being assaulted by him, Latinos are suffering. But if they can just hold on, I think they're gonna wake up. I'm very curious to see what the midterms, what's gonna happen. I suspect he's gonna lose seriously, just like Orban just lost in Hungary. People are gonna start waking up and hopefully be the wiser for it and start telling a counter story. Thank you.
All right.
I'd now defer to both of you if you have any closing comments with me.
Other than saying thank you so much for coming here and for sharing your conversation with us about this book, about history, about world affairs, about everything, about cats and tortoises, sorry, my bad.
Turtles are in the water, tortoises on the.
Sorry. My bad.
Hermes is his name. Little slow guy, his name is Hermes. That was my little 10-year-old's idea that we call him Hermes.
Oh, that's very good. Well, anyways, thank you again so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
And yeah,
Thank you to Mother Rollins for coming.
yes, thank you.
So my colleague Angela will now lead the end of the signing table. So while that is taking place, I just have a few very quick comments. And we'll ask you all just to remain in place while this is taking place. So we will begin the signing in just a moment. At that point, there will be a moment of chaos as everybody gets in line at a table just beside the cash desk. We'll be walking up and down the line to write your name on Post-it notes, which is not because we don't trust you to spell, but to ensure you can spend more time chatting rather than spelling when you get to the table. If you would like a photo, please just have your camera out and ready to go, as we do not know how to operate technology. We are booksellers. We're so very grateful you could all be here tonight. Thank you so very much. Oh, one other procedural note. If there is anyone in the crowd who is unable to stand through the line, just flag yourself to myself or another bookseller and we'll make sure that we can shift you up a little bit faster. But yes, we're so very grateful you could all be here tonight. So grateful to Knopf Canada for this book and this evening. So grateful to Ben Sigurdson for hosting. Please give him a round of applause. And of course, to Yann Martel. Thank you, everyone.